and this is what's going on. Namibia and Palestine's collective. Um, Brother Toivo, could you tell us how you're doing and then tell us what you got going on? The event is coming up. Is it Monday or next week?
Yeah, how y'all doing? Yeah, so this event's coming up this Sunday, 10 a.m. U.S. Eastern Standard Time. I kind of wanted to, kind of the idea came to us, end of last week, and I sort of kind of quickly, strung together some of my connections to see if we can make something happen. Most definitely, it's been fortuitous the timing because of the ICJ ruling today. And again, most of us don't particularly care about some of these things. We know they've made rulings against apartheid before, and it actually is the people on the ground who have to do the fighting. No matter what the community and solidarity can do, it was the ones on the ground who have to fight. But at the same time, it's a fortuitous time. People are talking about it, and I think that with Namibia in particular, um, it's a struggle that people know. Some of particularly a certain generation knows because the anti-apartheid struggle. But how can we reintroduce that to a newer generation of activists who are paying attention to Palestine? Because again, as many of you know, say what you want to say, these protests for Palestine have been really unprecedented in the United States and the world. And I think it's a time to kind of, open up avenues for more conversations, which I think we can have. So it'll be 10 a.m. this Sunday, which will be 5 p.m. that side in Africa. So we kind of did it on purpose so that their time can be centered because of the time differences.
Yeah, definitely. So as you talk about some of the organizers and you talk about online activists, and I want to play this video real quick. I know people saw it and made its rounds, but and after that, I want you to respond to again the idea of conflations of what's genocide, what's not genocide. You have German occupation of Namibia. You have the Israeli people occupied, and you have all these things, and people are not conflating. But this young person seems like they was struggling with some stuff. Let's hear it.
And I would like to use the rest of my time to say how appalled I am that people are bringing up the Holocaust. Do not use other genocides to describe this one. I have been... Oh.
So go ahead and share like the significance between Israel, Namibia, well, Palestine, Namibia, and just people's conception of what is atrocities, what's worth struggling around, and how we value, I guess, life.
So maybe just a question to kind of clarify. That's the first time I've ever seen that video. So I haven't seen. Am I even sure what the context is per se of that video?
So it's a supposedly Israeli activist who's telling them they can't compare the genocide that happened there to the genocide happened now, and she called it a genocide in her mind mistakenly. They called it a Freudian slip, but then somebody's started laughing. She's like, oh, but just this idea of this hard live contradictions of trying not to call this a genocide, but then in the same thing with Germany and Namibia, like they just now apologizing almost 100 years later with this weak ass apology with some money we talk about later. But yeah, just the contradictions of us, how we valuing what is worth having an uprising organized against and what is just should be forgotten.
Another question. I understand. Okay, so let me try to I'm trying to get better with my timing, or else I'm just going to go on, and I can't be complaining about certain people talking too much when I'm doing the same. So I'm going to give myself a little timer. So let me answer it this way. As you know, there are different wings in liberation struggles and the different orientations behind how an articulation of a struggle has to happen. So if you take, for example, like the book that I just wrote last year that came out last year, some of us, at least me, kind of align ourselves with like a Black consciousness tradition, right? So the Black consciousness tradition never understood the problem as apartheid. It was white settler colonialism. Because what apartheid ended up becoming was to say, well, it's just the Boers who came in 1949, 48, but everything else before was okay, in like 1913 Land Act and everything, etc. You know what I'm saying? So even how we name and phrase some of these things, and then the terms of genocide, even how genocide is created as a term, right? We've always known these things have happened. It's just the Europeans who had to tell themselves. You feel me? in the wake of World War II, in the wake of the real horrors that did happen, and not just to the Jews. We had, of course, the Roma people. We had homosexuals, LGBTQ community, right? The mentally handicapped, right? Many people were dying, right, and things were happening, right? And so I think yes, it comes out of that particular context. But what did M.S. Cesar say? He said the only reason people are calling these horrors is that Africa has been living this stuff before. M.S. Cesar basically saying is that this has been what people are actually angry with the Germans about is you brought the realities of colonialism to Europe's back door. That's what people were angry with you about. Keep that shit with the colonies. You know what I'm saying, right? But I think from our perspective, we are fighting white settler colonialism, right? And so for me, I try not to get too wrapped up in some of these terms because at the end of the day, for example, I come from the SWAPO movement on my father's side, right? We went to the International Court of Justice. People didn't do shit. Yes, they made some rulings, but the actual fighting had to be us on the ground and our comrades and colleagues like yourselves in the diaspora. That's who won the war, right? And even then, there were contradictions in the winning, as many of us know. And that's part of what this Sunday is going to bring. We have a group of younger activists now who are now leading what I want to call like a second Namibian liberation struggle, a newer generation now that's pushing things in ways that even some of us in the Southern African liberation context are having to grapple with in very interesting ways. So for me, I think some interesting questions are to say, for example, in Namibia that supposedly is liberated, one of the guest speakers who's coming on, she's a young sister who organizes in the anti-gender-based violence movement, in the LGBTQ struggle, right? As well as a host of other decolonial struggles. She's the one who led a movement in Windhoek, the capital of Namibia, to take down the statue that was in downtown Windhoek of that genocidal maniac. And imagine that in SWAPO being in government, that thing was up there even since independence. And there's reasons why that was the case, right? Given the global power of white supremacy and even the fact that we had to negotiate some of our independence, given the fall of the USSR, some interesting contradictions. We have to kind of understand these different things. So I think that to answer your question, part of what I want to reframe, what I want to kind of more say is that I'm not trying to get wrapped up in that conversation. What I want to focus on, what do we have to do to organize ourselves here to free Palestine? You feel me? And some of these white folks there, they're going to say what they're going to say because for them, they're white settler colonialists. So for them, they're going to always justify their rule, right? So you know what I mean? And so I think with us, the question is, what are we doing on the ground that's actively combating that, right? That's more maybe in a broad sense how I would try to answer that, is to say that certain lives, of course, for them it won't matter because they're white settler colonialists, right? So these things make sense. But for us, we need to be focused, our eye on the prize, as it will, which is liberating our people in Palestine as we liberate ourselves where we are at.
Definitely. So you kind of hit on it just now, but just for clarity, could you connect? So obviously the rebellion from 1904 to 1908, as the Namibians was fighting against European colonial rule, connect that to Palestine, and then also connected to Africans here in the U.S. And then particularly even in Atlanta, the struggle in Atlanta. Could you kind of do the connection? Because I know if we hear people be like, "Oh, why we worry about Palestine and what about the African people and all this other stuff?" But just kind of like quickly connect the three.
Shoo! You give me what, like 3-4 minutes? I mean, I'm a try, brother.
Take your time. Take your time.
So let's try it this way. So let me answer it in two ways. Am I able to share screen here?
You should be. If you can't. If you can't, I can send it to me.
I was just gonna put up a map of Namibia. To be honest, I think people need to see these things. I'm a big believer in, and maybe
I can find a map and put it up
myself. Just like maybe not right now, but like I'm trying to see. Let me see. Share screen. I think I see it. Share screen. Dismiss. Okay, I think I see it. Okay, cool. So I'm not going to share screen right now, but basically what I wanted to first say, though, I want to say to people who do say that, right, is I want to say a few things because I do disagree a little bit with some of the discourse out there that Black folk are not caring about this enough, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, of course, there's many of us who don't know and need to be educated, et cetera, right? But I think that if you think historically in the United States, we have been their greatest ally. And particularly if you think about the Palestinians who have been particularly having to live in Lebanon, Egypt, Syria, Saudi Arabia, all those countries there in the wake of 1948 and even previous attempts to kick them off their land. I think given as allies go, we stand among the top, I think, and very loyal to them. I think we've done the next outstanding job. I think there's a difference between talking about people understanding that it's a problem and what does it mean to actually be in community with and organizing with people. So to take it back to Atlanta, for example, this is a segregated city. This is an apartheid city. You know what I'm saying? Palestinians and Arabs and like regular, say Afro-American folk, I should say, because you have Afro-Caribbean, you've got second, third generations, right? You've got interesting peoples in Atlanta, right? That make up blackness here, right? They're not living together. And the few interactions that they have day to day are not necessarily great instances under an apartheid government, right? That does actually segregate people, right? So when certain people are having certain questions, we can't divorce the material reality from why they're asking questions, right? So it depends on who we're talking about, right? I'm not looking at the mainstream black liberals for guidance here, right? In terms of like the people on the block and what some of them are saying as we're mobilizing on these streets, right? So I think on one level, we have to answer that question on the streets. And the question that I have, for example, is, are we able to mobilize here, right? So in 2020, are the Palestinians in the street with us? Or is it just us? And if not, why? Not to necessarily flame them. It's just to say, well, why wasn't that the case? To actually analyze it. And then as organizers, how can we begin to now take this moment to bridge that gap? Because Palestine will not be free as long as the United States is alive. Because they're going to defend them to the death. So the ones you need to be mobilizing with is us, right here, because we're the main. So that's just normal. So I think let's just put that there. But to talk about some of the broader connections that you had, now maybe we'll share screen really quickly, to kind of just try to do this very fast to kind of give some folks some context for Sunday. And on Sunday, I'll do this again, but very much I want the others who are there to have their voices centered. Can you guys see this screen?
Yep.
Okay, so real brief. I'm gonna try to do this as fast as I can and to make sense. As many of you know, I want people in their minds to basically look at these borders and then imagine them that they don't exist, right? All these borders are fictitious. What is more important are some of the weather patterns in some of these places here you see, where you see more green than others, right? That tells you where people are going to be bunched up. That tells you where people are going to be moving from, right? Europeans begin to kind of land in this area where Cape Town is, roughly around in the 1500s. The Portuguese come first, eventually the Dutch, and eventually they begin to compete with each other to kind of take lands from Africans up in this area. Many of you know about Sarah Baartman, right? And so if you think of Sarah Baartman's ancestors, right? The San, the Khoikhoi, different sorts of indigenous African peoples here who are different than Bantu, but who are indeed Africans. We are all the same from the same source. They are the ones who interact with them first, and they get pushed out over the next 100, 200 years as the colonial project is continuing itself. Simultaneously, as you know, there's a slave trade that's happening from the 15th, 16th century that's pushing many Africans that were moving anyway down here. And that's your Bantu migrations, people you'll hear them talk about. Many of them eventually circle up here in Namibia in the north of the country, many of them having multiple waves of immigration because of colonialism in the 18th and 19th and 20th centuries, particularly the slave trade, which was destroying the inside of Africa, right? Not a lot of Afro-Americans are taught, because of how apartheid works, the horrors of the slave trade in the African continent and what it did to communities, right? So my people who live up here, our actual origins are easily more in Zimbabwe or further north. But because of just what colonialism does, we're pushed in these wars in some ways running, right? If we jump back here to these white settlers that begin to create what's called South Africa, they're pushing people out, and people are beginning to come and settle in what is Namibia down here, right? And so when this convergence comes, we actually don't have contact with each other. This is important. So like my ethnic group on my father's side, my mother's Afro-American, right? But on my dad's side, we are Ovambos. We're from the north, this place. The Hereros, Namas, and different ethnic groups and different people, so-called quote-unquote colors. We need to not use that term because it's actually not accurate to the different peoples and the richness of the ethnic diversity of these peoples, but are mostly in this area here. The Germans are now late to the colonial project, as many of you know. You know of the Berlin Conference, et cetera, Bismarck and them. They were relatively late because Germany's economy was strong enough. They didn't need colonialism like the other European colonies did. European countries did. They didn't need to colonialize as some of the French and the Portuguese and the British needed to, given the strength of their own economy. It was very interesting contradictions in capitalism there, right? But eventually they do grab colonies, right? And that is when they begin to land here. If we were to zoom in, part of what kept Namibia safe from the slave trade is that this coast, which is also very rich in fish resources, but also is a desert, this coast destroyed many slave ships, right? And so it's called Skeleton Coast National Park. You see this, right? So it kept us relatively safer from the slave trade, relatively, and other contradictions in terms of this a cold water current. It's hard to land there, but eventually technology gets better and they land. You see here, Walvis Bay. These areas here is where the Germans eventually begin to land, and they begin their own project going forward. We are a semi-arid country, mostly in the center and south. Think of Arizona in some ways, maybe more rockier in some ways, but also very deserty, if you will. Although climate change has made things worse, right? And they interact, the Germans, with the Herero, who were there, if you will, who were there, and they were in direct contact with some of the Namas and peoples who were coming in from the south, fleeing the Boers, right? And the British. They were in levels of just normal, just living together and conflicting together and living together and the normal stuff, right? And the Germans come in, of course, and do divide and conquer. Think of what what the British begin to do in the what becomes the United States with the Powhatan, and they're playing one against the other and beginning to introduce a level of modern warfare and basically killing that many Africans had just not been exposed to, right? And then they through divide and conquer, they basically begin to bring more people into this area of Namibia, the center and the south, and begin to create what you would know later as Lebensraum. Lebensraum, that what Hitler talked about, right? It is born in this project of trying to find living space for Germans in Eastern Europe, but also there was the application of Lebensraum to Africa, in particular Namibia. So this Lebensraum has a deep history, right? And the genocide that goes that yes, Jewish people were disproportionately hit by, absolutely. It has its roots, of course, in European anti-Semitism for hundreds of years, but also particularly with Germany right here in Africa. That is a direct connection that we must understand.
So before my brothers go, I'm gonna ask one more question. So after maybe centuries or more of denying that something happened there, the Germans are now saying that they apologize and they're supposed to compensate Namibia 1.1 billion over 30 years, right? That'll be $36 million a year. The descendants and the other victims and the broad base of the people are not even in agreement with it. They didn't agree to it. But also from 1945 to 2018, the Germans already paid 86.8 billion to Israel. So kind of talk about this apology and this cheap payment of 1.1 billion for over 30 years. What's your thoughts about that? And
so let me draw this connection, wrapping up this history to draw the connection, I think will answer the question. The reason why I gave that breakdown of the countries because that actually lies the answer to your question, right? So part of what happens, and the reason why I laid that out, is that when the genocide happens in the uprising of 1904, 90% of the Herero population and 80% of the Nama population is wiped out. And many of the 10% who survive have to struggle to Botswana. So the paramount Herero chief, who originally did sign a treaty with the Germans, but eventually did rebel against them because his junior commanders were pushing and bucking at the teeth, right? He has to flee to Botswana. So there are many Hereros who are in Botswana. So the reason why this becomes important is because those who were disproportionately hit by the genocide were the Herero and Nama folks. Us in the north, while we were fighting the Germans, we, given some of our history, were not hit with the genocide in that way. So when the actual liberation movement comes, when the white government, white South Africans, kick out the Germans, and that whole, project comes, and then SWAPO forms, etc., disproportionately, it is a Vambu movement, which does not have a tie to the Herero and Nama genocide the way Hereros and Namas do. It doesn't mean that the Hereros and Namas were voiceless during the major part of the liberation movement, but the disproportional voice was coming from the north, right? And then when we fast forward to independence, the truth of the matter is that East Germany was very much in alignment with SWAPO, the liberation movement. East Germany, and many of the early histories that you'll see on the genocide that are Germans who are writing it are like East German / Marxist, this Marxist tradition, right? So there actually is a very good relationship there. I was living in Germany 6 years because my father was assigned there, right? For the country, but also as the party in some ways, right? And we took East Germany very seriously because we had those communist ties, right? And so I say that to say that a particular wing of the government and even people in the north, I'll tell you, they either agree with this or they don't particularly care. So I don't think it is. So it is actually, and this tells you about in the post-independence moment, why we have to begin to start thinking about how do we begin to center different voices and actually what having control of the state does in a nation state sense with a country that's multi-ethnic and multinational. So what I would say is that's why on Sunday, the ones who we are bringing, while Hildegard, one of them, the one who helped push the statue down is Vambu, like myself, right? The others are not on purpose because their voice needs to be made heard here. And because for them, right, they were very much rejecting it. But as you will know, we still also inherited a colonial education, which means many students did not learn about this genocide, even they themselves who went through it, because parents didn't talk about these things. The horrors of it, people kept quiet. We know how this happens with Native Americans here. We know our parents ain't telling us about slavery and why they ran from down south up north and what actually happened to Uncle Tony when we never saw him again. People don't talk about, they keep these things inside, as we know. The same is happening down there. And so a new generation of people are coming up and are beginning to learn. So I think this is also part of what's also happening. And I want to kind of lay that out, that there is a tension there between this younger generation that's learning this stuff, right? Right. And then you have the government, which is disproportionately vulnerable. It's true. Right. And not because we're tribal, just because that's the demographics. We're like 60% of the population because we didn't get hit with genocide, 90%. We didn't. Not saying we didn't suffer. We died in our thousands. But there are two different phases of our colonial history we have to understand with Namibia, right? And these things are playing out there. So I want to lay that out as an answer to your question. There are contradictions there, and that's why the government was willing to accept that, because they were also willing to accept that, also it came during COVID. This is important too. Our economies were really on the brink. And Namibia, we import 70% of our food stuff. So if we lose certain access to monies, we are going to starve.
Right.
Okay? So that's part of where that deal comes in. That's part of what happens at that context that I think people also need to. I'm not saying to give them an excuse. I'm saying that like this is how the capitalist economy disciplines the nation states, even if you feel that you're radical in certain conditions.
That's a fact. So Diallo, Jared, any questions or comments you have for the brother?
No, I just appreciate the breakdown and the connections being made. It was very dope, and I agree with everybody in the chat saying that you should come back sooner than later and spend more time more regularly, in fact. But those connections are essential, and I really appreciate it. So thank you.
All right. Yeah. Diallo?
Yeah, I appreciate it. The scope is rather wide, but I do appreciate the breakdown.
Absolutely. So there's another thing I wanted to share right quick and then get your thoughts of it. So obviously there's been a connection, as you talked about, with the PLO and Namibia, and here they even talked about how the struggles are strikingly linked. So my question is, one, I guess you can reaffirm that, but what are your thoughts on the maybe the teeth and the effectiveness of the UN today, and maybe even the United Nations Convention Against Genocide? Like, what type of teeth or effectiveness, or just your thoughts on their ability to like help Namibia, or I don't know if that makes sense, but do they have any power at this point?
No, excellent question. And actually, it's a fun fact, right? I would love for you to send me that document. The man who wrote that document, Mr. Terche, he's my father's colleague. My father sat next to him in the UN in the 80s. So he's actually very close with him. So I know Terche, actually. My father worked with him closely in SWAPO. My father was the deputy representative for SWAPO at the UN. So that document right there, my father sat right next to him. And that actually leads to your question again, right? When Namibia finally won independence in 1990, we moved from the representative, like you had like representative, like observer status. You weren't like a nation yet, right? It was like a recognition of you in a certain way, right? So we moved from that section, my dad told me, to now where the states, if you will, sit. And my father said from SWAPO, he said from SWAPO to his colleague there, the PLO, eventually you will join us down there, right? That was what people believed in 1990. Eventually Palestine will join us down here as a state and you will be recognized, right? And so I sort of want to kind of maybe think about that in some sense. And can you maybe repeat the first part of your question? Because you asked a lot there. Yeah,
just more so of like, I just really want like reaffirm the connection, but I just wanted to see how you think the UN, because again, at some points we would go to present things to the UN to hope that they would enforce something. But what's your thoughts in terms of what kind of teeth do they have, and what kind of power?
So it's interesting coming from a Namibian, and my dad will give you a different answer, right? So he's there in the village right now, doing his thing, right? I'm of that generation where I think that the UN was useful to us in these ways. It did give, say, SWAPO, for example, it gave us a global platform to communicate with people. That's very important for a movement that's out in Namibia. Before there was Twitter, Instagram, all these TVs, whatever, right? How can we talk to people? You know what I'm saying? It did give you that. There's no questions about that. And there's positives and negatives that come with that, right? My namesake, Toivo, was able to smuggle his message out with Michael Scott, who then plays this message in front of the UN. That did bring some things to light that the South Africans were lying about, at least put it on the table. When Afro-Americans, Leroy Jones at the time, who would be Mary Baraka, Maya Angelou, and others stormed the UN in 1961 in the wake of Lumumba's death, right? These things mattered. I want to be very clear, right? But the UN itself is not fighting no liberation struggle for no one, right? And it is SWAPO, it is the Panthers, it is the Republic of New Africa, it is Frelimo, it is the Trinidad movement, the New Jewel movement, it is Bishop, it is those ones who are doing the fighting. The UN has never liberated anybody, right? So I think that as long as we understand that, then use the UN for what is needed. Yes, to articulate certain things are very important in certain contexts if you wish to do so. Right. But my belief is in the radical movement. Right. We must always understand our relationship to these things, but always keep our mind on the movement itself. The UN right now was never going to do anything about Palestine. The UN is housed in New York City. Give me a break. What do you think they're going to do? Right. They ain't no army. They ain't going to go. What you going to stop them? Because again, you have to understand, even if you read the mainstream media's reports on the Israeli cabinet right now, the far right people, even the CIA and these other people, they don't talk to those guys because they're ideologically you can't talk to them. They don't care. They're like, oh, yeah, the world's going to end. And they are ideologically fixed. There's no negotiation. It's like us in the South. People talk about the Civil War about slavery, If you read South Carolina's document when they are seceding and, to start the Civil War, I believe every word they said. I do believe that they felt that their rights were being infringed. That's why we had to fight these motherfuckers. Right. So it's not about, for example, me talking about like the UN and these. The UN ain't gonna. What did CLR James say? He said parliaments don't make revolutions; they only register them. Right. And it's true. Right. The UN is not going to start nothing. It's just going to register the power relations. And as long as the United States backs Israel, Israel will do whatever the F it wants to do. And in their mind, they're putting pressure on Egypt because they want to push those Palestinians into Egypt, and they will never let them return. And Egypt knows that. And that's exactly what everybody knows, right? And I think this is what now the question comes, are you going to physically stop them? And that's why I'm saying that this is why the UN is not that kind of a body. This ICJ, I think it's good for conversation. It's good for, certain people who don't know, to kind of get certain people in the convo. I think some of us do need to give a radical analysis of it. But in terms of us on the block, we have to actually organize in the streets. When my dad was mobilizing here in the U.S. for SWAPO, he was clear, I got to work with people like Ilombe Brath, like Ilombe. My dad knows Ilombe. He was there speaking at his funeral. Namibia flew him out directly to speak at Ilombe's funeral because he says, no, we work with that brother because he helped liberate our country. So I think that's where I want our emphasis to be, on the street corners and to mobilize with our people to fight. Because yes, we need to have this solidarity, but at the end of the day, we have to make it happen. There ain't no tooth fairy for revolution. We are the ones that have to pull out the teeth.
Yeah. Now listen, that's called my boy. You know nothing about that.
So definitely make sure you show love to my brother. And there's a registration form. I guess.
Yeah, sorry. It's just mostly for security purposes. So please just do it so we can screen. The crazy people out here. We want to be able to kind of see who is who. And we will have people with certain powers to kick certain folks off because you don't know who these things attract. But I think it should be fine. It's mostly for that purpose.
Absolutely. If the brothers don't have any more questions, any final words?
No, I got a lot. I just want to be back in my spot to have a better conversation. So we got to have the brother. You got to come back. I got many questions.
And I feel bad. I feel very bad for Ball because I was supposed to talk to you about the Black Panther movie a while ago, but my partner was giving birth and my life just went a certain way, and we had stuff here in Atlanta with our comrades getting shot and arrested, so things just kind of went. But I gotta take an L for that. I didn't hit you back with something on the Black Panther take, but I gotta take accountability for that.
The only error is you just called me Jared. That's the only flaw. everything, all else is forgiven. When you having babies and dropping analysis like that, there's no problem here. So congratulations and thank you for your work. And I can't wait to build with you again, man. Thank you very much.
Brother, thank you. We'll
All right,
talk to
y'all.
you soon. All right, peace.
All right, peace.